Imagine a world where Harlem jazz becomes poetry, but in Martinique, where Afro-Cuban rhythms echo the same longing for freedom expressed in West Africa and Senegal, and where a preacher from Atlanta flies across the ocean to witness a new African nation rise from colonial rule. Before we had global playlists or viral remixes, the African diaspora was already in deep conversation, sharing rhythms, sharing dreams, and sharing visions of liberation. And that dialogue is exactly what we're exploring today. Welcome to A Griot's History, where we help you master the AP African American Studies exam with culture, with story, and with soul. Today's journey, we're looking at global Black artistic movements and the rise of transnational Black activism in the early 20th century. Let's dive in. This lesson covers units 4.1 to 4.3, where we explore how Black artists, activists, and thinkers connected across continents to challenge colonialism and imagine new futures. Here are your must-know essentials. Négritude and Negrismo affirmed African heritage across the diaspora. They shared cultural pride, but imagined Blackness differently. Négritude emerges in the Francophone Caribbean and Africa regions, and Negrismo rises in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. Thinkers like Césaire, Jesse Redmond, and Fawcett criticized colonialism as a racist system of exploitation. From the 1940s to the 1970s, Black freedom struggles became transnational. African Americans visited Africa, the Caribbean. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King in Ghana in particular in 1957, Joe Louis in Cuba in 1960, and Maya Angelou and Julia Mayfield in Ghana in 1963. These African Americans forged diasporic solidarity and brought attention to decolonization, especially in the Year of Africa in 1960. Our historical skill today is comparison, plus argumentation through art, activism, and global identity. And by the end, you'll connect cultural aesthetics to freedom movements, politically and socially. First, during the early 20th century, Black artists across the world started asking the same bold question: what would it look like if we celebrated African culture on our own terms? Well, in New York, the New Negro movement uplifted Black creativity and self-definition. And in Martinique and Senegal, Négritude writers reclaimed African identity with fierce pride. In Spanish-speaking countries like Cuba and Puerto Rico, Negrismo artists blended rhythm and folklore and poetry rooted in African heritage. Though separated by oceans, they shared a common emotional experience: the need to create beauty in the face of colonial lies. Write down one cultural tradition you've seen that connects the diaspora. Second, these movements weren't carbon copies. The New Negro movement pushed for dignity and political rights in the United States, while Négritude rejected European assimilation and emphasized a proud return to African cultural roots, and Negrismo embedded African traditions into music and poetry and performance. So yes, they shared an emphasis on cultural pride, but the texture of that pride, the rhythm, the politics, the imagery, shifted depending on the place. This distinction is critical for the AP exam because comparison requires noticing both overlap and difference. Third, these artistic movements set the stage for something bigger: a global Black freedom movement that extended itself through the 20th century. From the 1940s to the 1970s, Black civil rights struggles became transnational, international. Artists and activists recognized that their fights were connected, whether it be lynching in the United States, forced labor in the Congo, suppressed languages in the Caribbean, or colonial rule in West Africa. This understanding of these connections led to real-world alliances. Martin Luther King traveled to Ghana as early as 1957, where he witnessed the birth of a new African nation of Ghana. He said that it renewed his belief that freedom was possible in the United States of America. Joe Louis traveled to Cuba in 1960 with a delegation of Black business leaders exploring tourism as an escape from Jim Crow. Maya Angelou, Julian Mayfield, Pauli Murray, and others lived and organized in Ghana in the 1960s, forming a Black internationalist community pushing global liberation, the first Black expats of the 20th century. This wasn't a small matter. In 1960, the Year of Africa was critical. 17 nations achieved independence. Solidarity was no longer symbolic, it was real, political, social, and military action. Let's slow this down and look at the evidence. This is the kind of evidence that the AP exam loves because it turns ideas into analysis. Les fichiers Louise Malou Jones, painted a narrative. Her picture was an African-American artist traveling through Paris at a time where African art was dismissed as primitive, as essential. She said no African aesthetics are sophisticated and essential to modern art. Her painting shifted the features of African masks, arranging them like a constellation, each one symbolic, commanding, and powerful. Why does this matter? This painting is a visual argument. It says that African culture belongs at the center of modern creativity, not the margins. Jones uses modernist style to assert African dignity in global art. La Jungla by Wilfredo Lame in 1943. Lame grew up Afro-Cuban and Chinese in a country dominated by sugar plantations and colonial hierarchies. He saw how Afro-Cuban spirituality was suppressed and how colonial powers profited off of black labor. So he created La Jungla, a surreal, dreamlike forest of hybrid masks figures that appeared powerful and trapped at the same time. Why does this matter? Because this is what resistance looked like in artistic expression, in paint. It critiques colonial exploitation while celebrating Afro-Cuban culture. Our next source is Discourse on Colonialism by Amy Césaire of 1955. Césaire didn't write gently, not at all. This book is a punch to colonial hypocrisy. He argues that Europeans dehumanized Africans, and in doing so, dehumanize themselves. He exposes how colonialism relies on racism, capitalism, and violence. This text became a manifesto for anti-colonial thought throughout Africa and the Caribbean, inspiring future causes and revolutions. Martin Luther King's source in newly independent Ghana 1957 explains this narrative. He stood among thousands of Ghanaians chanting, crying, celebrating freedom. And King later said that, quote, "The birth of this new nation will give hope to people everywhere." You see, this wasn't just a trip. It was a spiritual and political awakening. It shows that African American leaders saw African independence as a part of their own struggle. Joe Louis's delegation to Cuba in 1960, he joined a delegation of black businessmen and women in media to go to Cuba, where they met with Cuban officials to discuss and promote Cuba as a place where black Americans could travel without segregation. It's a story rarely told in textbooks, but it reveals the creativity of black internationalism. Civil rights wasn't only marches and sit-ins, it was diplomacy, it was travel, it was global coalition building. Maya Angelou and Julian Mayfield petitioning in Ghana was important too. You see, imagine this. Outside of the United States Embassy in Accra, Maya Angelou and Mayfield and a group of African-American expatriates held signs demanding justice back home. They weren't escaping the United States. They were helping to lead a global critique of racism in the United States. This moment captures the heart of diasporic solidarity in the 1960s. Black freedom movements supporting one another across international borders. These artifacts show how art, travel, writing, and political action were woven together. The diaspora wasn't just connected, it was collaborating. Now let's fast forward for our Black popular culture moment. Think about Stromae, the Rwandan Belgian artist, in songs like Papulate. Stromae wrestles with identity, loss, and the legacy of colonialism. His visuals mix African aesthetics, European electronic sound, and symbolic storytelling. He just doesn't make music. He performs the complexity of the diaspora. Just like Césaire or Angelou in Ghana, Stromae confronts history through art. That's not coincidence. As we say before, that's continuity and that's legacy. So what do we take away? First, cultural movements like Négritude and Negrismo reclaimed African identity and rejected colonial narratives. The Black freedom movement became global, linking US civil rights, Black power, and African decolonization. And third, diasporic solidarity amplified liberation movements across the continents, from Ghana to Cuba to the United States, from Harlem to Havana, from Accra to Paris, from Césaire's pen to Stromae's mic. Black creativity has always carried the weight of history and the promise of liberation, because history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. I'm Dr. Kamasi Hill, and this has been A Griot's History. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the story alive.